What's good, family? Smash the like button and subscribe. Wow. So, as you might have seen by the title, Iron Mike Tyson has made some comments regarding AJ, Tyson Scary, aka Tyson Fury, and Deontay Wilder. And essentially, he believes, he's pretty confident, he would have beaten Tyson Scary and Anthony Joshua. However, he's not sure whether or not he'd have been able to beat Deontay Wilder. Now, it's kind of shocking still, to be fair, because the way he's so certain. In fact, you know what? Let me give you the quotes on what he said about AJ and Fury, because essentially he says, "There's no doubt I would have beaten them too. Yes, listen, if you're asking me if I was 20 years old, then yes, there's no doubt I would have beaten Fury and AJ." So, that's what he says about AJ and Fury, but his Wilder comments are essentially he's not sure. So he's certain on whooping AJ and Fury, but he's not certain about whether he would have been able to beat Wilder. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't really go into too much detail on why, which is unfortunate, but that's why I don't really like Mike Tyson's podcast. There's not much, in my opinion, there's not much depth to it. People don't, it's all a bit, in my opinion, it's all a bit goofy and trivial these days. When you think of Mike, me personally, when I think of Mike, I think he knows a lot more about the technical side of the sport than he lets on, or at least than his podcast lets on. I feel like now his podcast has become more about weed and just trying to be, I don't know, trying to be edgy. That's how I feel now. Now, obviously it's horses for courses, but in comparison, now I'm not saying, I don't even really watch Teddy Atlas's podcast so much, but my point is, Teddy Atlas's podcast, you get a lot more, he talks about psychology, you know what I'm saying? He talks about different elements of different fighters and different matchups, and he goes deep on the technical, psychological, all the different sides of boxing. Mike Tyson, on the other hand, obviously different podcasts are cool. No one says Mike Tyson has to do a strict technical boxing podcast, but I'm just saying, I feel Mike's hot boxing podcast is kind of trivial still. It's kind of skin deep. Now, obviously, it's entertaining to some people, but when you make comments, big statements like this, i.e., oh, AJ and Fury would have been easy work, but Wilder, I'm not so sure. If you're going to make them big statements, then, in my opinion, you have to take a step back from all of the fruitiness, all of the trying to be edginess, and flesh it out a bit. I'm sure there'll be some Mike Tyson fans who say, YB, he don't have to do anything. Well, he don't, I'm just saying. Because I find it intriguing. When you have three current fighters, Wilder, Fury and AJ, yeah, in their current state they're in, and you make a statement like that, fair enough if he'd have come out and said, yeah, I'd have whooped all three. Or, normally how it goes is, yeah, these old time heads, they say things like, yeah, I'd have whooped all three, or, no, we're all the same, or, no, they would have whooped me. That's how it normally goes. But when you start picking different individuals out, it kind of, you've got to come with some substance. How can you be dead certain you'd... listen, I know why you're dead certain why you'd run through Fury, because he ain't got no chin. How about that? Yeah, and I'm not going to lie. Me personally, prime Mike Tyson, undercuss, cuss there, yeah, well that is prime Mike Tyson. Prime Mike Tyson, undercuss. In my opinion, there ain't no heavyweight born from nowhere who can beat that Mike Tyson. No way. There just ain't. I believe Mike was a different animal then. Mike, I believe with Cuss in the corner, Mike, I would have loved to have seen, I would love to have seen the psychological element if Cuss had stayed around. Because I believe, personally, Mike, for example, we know Mike quit against quite a few fighters. He quit against Holyfield a few times. Not quit, sorry, the first fight he didn't quit, but either way he lost. But the second fight he quit, rightly or wrongly. And I believe under Cuss, Mike There's no way. When you hear about the way Mike talked about Cuss, yeah, there's no way he'd have allowed himself to perform like that. He would have he would have gone out, spark out on his back before coming back to the corner to have to go and see Cuss, knowing that he'd jacked, knowing that he'd found a way out of a fight, kind of thing. Obviously, when Cuss passed away, that rigidity, that bond was broken, and he obviously didn't have the personal fortitude to do it for himself, if that makes sense. Which is, to be fair, often how a lot of life goes. Many people say, "Oh, I do this for my wife and kids." So most people do things, unless you're a narcissist or whatever. Most people do things for other people, or with other people in mind. So it's not revolutionary to think that Mike Tyson was able to be a stronger individual with Cuss. So on that note, bottom line for me, no one beats Mike Tyson under Cuss. Now, if we're going to make it interesting, an average, maybe it's not best to look at the best version. What about an average version? How does an average Tyson come up against an average AJ or average Fury? Well, for me, I'm sorry, you might know my opinion. I just don't rate Fury. I really don't. I feel at the top level in sport, you have to start bringing some attributes. You have to start bringing some world-class Hall of Fame attributes. To beat Hall of Fame athletes, you have to bring Hall of Fame attributes. Apart from being 6'9", what Hall of Fame attributes does Tyson Fury have? I'm sure there'll be a lot of casual fans who say, "Oh, YB, he's got a Hall of Fame or world-class IQ." Me personally, I just don't see it. For example, a lot of boxing fans today, I can't blame them because they themselves are low IQ, but a lot of boxing fans or sporting fans in general, they make a claim and don't back it up. Oh, like for example, if you look through my comments, yeah, especially my comment sections where I'm critical of AJ and his training and how he's fighting at the moment, yeah, you'll see people say, "YB, you're wrong," and then that's it. They don't give no context, and the thing is, when people try and come up against a YB, there ain't no context, because guess what? I'm right. How about that? You can't give context when someone's right. All you can do is say, "Oh, you're wrong. Oh." Yeah? So like I said, rather than saying, "Oh, IQ," what does Fury do that's so IQ? Okay, he puts a few feints in, but what do we know now? AJ doing the same stuff in about 6 months of camps. Yeah? A year of camps, and he can do it just as well. He can do all that fruity dancy rubbish as well. Now what? For example, Lomachenko, in contrast, people say Lomachenko has high IQ. Why that's different is, I've watched Lomachenko shut down Rigondeaux with his IQ. I've never seen Fury shut someone down, and Fury's even taller than Lomachenko was. People forget that. There's being tall in itself. Anyone who's boxed will know that when your opponent's obscenely tall, it can shut you down as an opponent. The range just shuts you down. That's an element in its own right. But being shut down with IQ is a whole other thing. Rigondeaux, yes, he got shut down to an extent with height, but there weren't 10 inches in it. The other part of it was IQ. Lomachenko just had his number. Bottom line, it's a bit like Tony Bellend. Tony Bellend versus Usyk. Usyk just had his number. Simple as that. He was done after a few rounds. He was finished. And not only that, a lot of people talk about Tyson Fury and they talk about IQ, but in my opinion, yeah, IQ is more about offense. Or sorry, there's different types of IQ. In my opinion, the IQ that matters is offensive IQ. IQ when you're in range, rather. having like dancing away. I just don't rate that. I don't know. It doesn't add value. Now, how many times, for example, I've seen Lomachenko move forward and cut an angle. He'll pivot and cut an angle to open his opponent up on the inside. He's creating space. He's creating openings for himself to capitalize on. That's IQ. Same as Usyk versus Tony Belland. Doing things to find angles, to find places to score big points against his opponents. That's IQ. Show me where Fury's done that. Now, don't get me wrong. I've seen Fury in there with Wilder, fainting and slapping away on Wilder's guard, but that he won't. Show me where Fury's really creating openings on Wilder. Fury was just plugging away against the heavy bag. That's what he did. I don't. Genuinely, you man tell me and I'll have a look. Tell me a fight where you've seen Fury do some real creative things to score big points. I haven't seen it. For example, the Vlad fight. Everyone hails him for being a magician. The Vlad fight, you have to remember, people, all he's doing is landing a jab. And when you're fighting someone and you're 6'9", I'm sorry, that in my opinion, that comes with the territory. When you're 6'9", you've got half decent speed, it's a given that you're going to land a jab. I mean, if you want a great example of what I'm talking about here, look at Fury versus Chisora. What stands out? His jab. He's just landing it. But that isn't magic. If you watch Fury versus Chisora and call that IQ, you don't know what you're talking about. Fury versus Chisora 2, sorry. All that is being 6'9" and the other man being a foot smaller. That's all it is. Nothing else in it. When you're that tall and long, if you can't do that, you ain't no good. Now, I'm not saying Fury isn't a world-class fighter, but we're talking about Hall of Fame and world-class. What Fury does so far, in my opinion, it's world-class for someone 6'9". It ain't Hall of Fame. It just ain't. It's pretty average. It's pretty standard, as we've seen from AJ, if that makes sense. The way AJ's been able to take what Fury does and replicate it more or less in a year, it's not rocket science. The higher level things are always to do with point scoring. For example, people talk about Fury's IQ. Comparatively, look at Mayweather. Look at the things Mayweather did against Canelo Alvarez. Canelo was the bigger man, yeah, but look at the things he did. Look, not even just that fight. Look at all of his fights. Look at all of Mayweather's fights in his latter years. He's able to control the pace of the fight. He isn't just using his attributes. Mayweather doesn't. For example, all of the fights you see, yeah, Fury win against Vlad, against Chisora, they're all him essentially abusing or him exploiting his attributes. Oh, I'm taller than you, I'm longer than you, I'm going to land my jab before you can land yours. That's all it is. Whereas Mayweather weren't playing that game. Mayweather, I'm not even sure how to explain it, but Mayweather exploits IQ. He's able to do things, he's able to use his speed and hit you more than you can hit him. With power shots. We've seen pull right hands. We've seen all sorts. And I think the key separator of what I'm talking about here is basically essentially power shots. When you're able to land power shots and your opponents aren't, that's what IQ is. The most simple way of thinking about it. Now, how many times have you seen Tyson Fury landing power shots and his opponent can't? Oops. You don't. You just don't see that. Now, again, Fury plastering forward and laying it on Wilder when Wilder isn't throwing back. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about, we've seen Canelo Alvarez come forward against Mayweather, throw his own shots miss, and Mayweather hit him with a stinging right hand. That's what IQ is. You and your opponent are both engaging, and you're getting off all over him, and he's hitting thin air. That's IQ. Fury don't do that. I'm sorry. If you disagree, show me it. Show me where you see Fury getting off power shots and his opponents ain't landing. Yeah, you ain't seeing that. So let's get rid of that whole IQ argument. So really, what does Fury have apart from attributes? Nothing. And that's the point here. AKA, someone like Mike Tyson cut straight through him. AJ, on the other hand, now I'm not saying he's nowhere near his prime. So to be honest, like I said, Mike Tyson would beat AJ, but AJ trained the right way. That for me, you might know my opinion. I believe, athletically speaking, he's got the best base in history. If I had to pick a fighter who has the best base to go off of, for example, in my opinion, if you put someone like AJ with a trainer like Custiamato, like Shane McGuigan, I struggle. He'd be up there. My number one fighter, prime for prime, is Mike Tyson. My number two, prime for prime, with the right trainer, is AJ. That's my opinion. I believe AJ is able to combine the principles of Mike Tyson with also the attributes of someone longer. So essentially, his Hove is best of both worlds. He can stay at mid-range and jab your nut right in for you, play the 1-2 game, or he can open up, or similar to Mike Tyson. Obviously, he's never going to be as explosive or as short as Mike. Mike had little T-Rex arms, but he's the next best thing. Like I said, best of both worlds. He has the ability to be the best all-round fighter in history. And that's what I believe that's what we're seeing now. That's why we see it. That's why AJ can all of a sudden, in only a year of training, can be as good as Fury's spent his whole life being. In my opinion, AJ's as slippery as Fury's ever been on the outside. But that's not all he can do. Guess what? That's all really Fury can do. He can't. Yeah, he beat Wilder up on the inside, but Wilder was standing there. I believe, yeah, if Wilder had tucked his chin down and dug back with Fury, it would have been a 50-50 fight. But the fact he stood there like a heavy bag, the fact he can't fight on the inside at all, he got exposed. If Wilder had any inside fighting ability, that all of a sudden goes to a 50-50 fight. If not, the edge is actually on Wilder's favour. Why? Because he has the power advantage. But he never trains to fight on the inside. And that's why I find it most suspect when Mike Tyson says that, Wilder would beat me, but AJ and Fury wouldn't. How would Wilder beat you? I actually think, Wilder's probably the most beatable from Mike Tyson's point of view. Because Wilder, as much as I said Fury doesn't have attributes, to be fair to Fury, we've at least seen Fury dig in on the inside. He's no good at it. He hits himself with uppercuts, but he can actually go there. He wouldn't last long going there against Mike, because Mike would open him up, but the point is, he can actually, I don't believe Fury would just shell up initially. I think after Mike lands a few good shots, if Fury was still conscious, he would shell up and go into put his earmuffs on. But initially, I believe Fury would try and dig back. Because we've seen him in there with people like John McDermott and Derek Chisora in the first fight. He was getting worked and he fought back. Which, I have to give credit to him for that. But he ain't no good at doing that. Hence why the first fights were super close. Because he can't bang. He doesn't have the attribute. He doesn't have the genetics for that. Wilder, he just stand there. He heavy bag. So I don't know what Mike's talking about. It would have been a tough fight. It would have been a harder fight. How would it be harder? Unless he's talking about the right hand from Wilder. But not being funny, Mike Tyson would. Let's not make out Wilder's right hand's really controlled. With pressure, we've seen Wilder fall apart under pressure from Lewis Ortiz, who doesn't have. Do you know how people don't appreciate? Do you know how quickly Mike Tyson was kind of sprinting forwards against his opponents? He was rapid. When you hear from some of Mike Tyson's opponents, they talk about how he was on you like a whatever, rapid coming forward. Ortiz is old, 70-year-old legs. And he had Wilder shook for 4 rounds. So how, you know what I'm saying? If Wilder can't throw a right hand against Ortiz with 70-year-old legs, how is he going to get his shot off against Mike? A prime Mike Tyson steaming forward with rapid feet and rapid hands. Don't think so. So I don't get what he means about Wilder being a harder fight. Now, of course, if you stand there smiling like Ortiz did and you get clipped, then yeah, you're going to get knocked out. But Mike Tyson never stood there smiling at mid-range. He was always either coming forward or... Yeah, Mike Tyson was always coming forward or on top of you, grappling. He was never just sitting at mid-range. Never. You, man, show me a fight where Mike Tyson sits at mid-range. Never. So again, it's a shame we didn't get to hear more context here, but I'm telling you, man, Mike would munch them all. And then AJ trained the right way would be a tough fight. I'd put it this way. AJ with a Hall of Fame trainer and Mike Tyson with a Hall of Fame trainer. Who wins? It goes with AJ in my opinion, because a great big man always beats a great small man in my opinion. And we've seen Mike, his power was great, but when he came up against Hall of Famers, you need more than just power at that level. And AJ's jab would separate that. AJ's jab and right hand, I think, would separate. I think that would be the differential to win the fight on points against Mike, against the prime Mike. Although it would come down to, can AJ's chin, if it took a clean one from Mike, could it absorb it? Could AJ withstand? Because initially, the first few rounds, you'd have to survive. You'd have to survive it through there. But again, I think AJ being the hybrid he is, I think he'd be able to negotiate the first 3 or 4 rounds where Mike's most dangerous, and then push on from there. So, like I said, all in all, a prime AJ with the right trainer, I'd back him to beat a prime Mike. But like I said, that's only on the basis that AJ had a new trainer. AJ without a new trainer gets smoked every time. This AJ now wouldn't last 4 rounds. Well, tell a lie, he'd run. And that's a fair point, to be fair. Would he be able to run from Mike? That's another... Who knows, maybe he would. Because his legs are good. He does have quick legs, in my opinion, quicker than Fury's. So I don't know, maybe he'd be able to pull it off on points as well and bore everyone to tears. So, again, that's what's so great about being a hybrid. You can do it both ways.